Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we are taking on a topic that is, I think, one of the most sophisticated, high-wire balancing acts in all of medicine.
It really is. We're talking about the human immune system.
We are, but not in the way you usually hear about it. I mean, the entire cultural conversation seems to be about boosting immunity. Eat this, take that, fight the cold, destroy the invader.
Right. It's all about making it stronger, more aggressive. But today, we're flipping that on its head.
Exactly. Today we are doing the exact opposite. We're talking about the science of restraint, the pharmacology of holding back.
We're looking at immunosuppression. And to get our heads around this, we are digging into two of the absolute foundational texts in pharmacology.
The heavy hitters. We're pulling from Goodman and Gilman's The Pharmacological Basis of Therapeutics, specifically their chapter on immunosuppressants and tolerogens.
And we're pairing that with Katzung's Basic and Clinical Pharmacology, their chapter on immunopharmacology. And they complement each other perfectly for this topic.
How so? What does each one bring to the table for you?
Well, Katzung provides this incredible clarity and a kind of clinical scaffolding. It gives you the how do we actually treat the patient? What's the framework?
Okay, the practical application.
Exactly. And then Goodman and Gilman comes in with this deep molecular reasoning, the why. Why is the cell behaving this way? What's the fundamental mechanism? And when you put them together, you get a full picture of a field that is just constantly wrestling with a central paradox.
Let's start right there with that paradox.
Yeah.
Because the human immune system, it's an absolute evolutionary masterpiece, right?
Oh, absolutely. It's designed from the ground up to be aggressive. It's redundant. It's lethal.
And its entire job is to destroy anything that isn't self.
Precisely. Evolution has spent millions of years refining this system to be an incredibly efficient killing machine. It distinguishes self from non-self with, frankly, ruthless efficiency.
And that's the problem.
That is the problem we face in modern medicine, because sometimes we need to introduce non-self to save a life, like a kidney transplant or a heart. Or sometimes the system just gets confused and starts attacking self, which is what we see in autoimmune diseases.
So the mission for this deep dive, then, is to really understand how we handcuff this system. How do we deliberately quiet immunity to protect a transplanted organ, or treat something like lupus or rheumatoid arthritis without leaving the body completely defenseless?
It's what Goodman and Gilman calls the strategy of choosing restraint. We're not trying to obliterate the immune system. If we did that, the patient would die from the common cold.
Right.
We're trying to modulate it. We're trying to find the volume knob and just turn it down. Just enough so the new organ survives, but the patient does too.
Okay, so before we jump into the deep end, let's give everyone a roadmap. We always say this is an interpretive synthesis of the chapters, meant to give you a conceptual map to take back to the reading. So we've distilled what we think are the big 5 takeaways. What should you be listening for today?
Right, let's lay out the framework. First, and this is huge, is checkpoints as targets. We've moved beyond just globally suppressing immunity. Now we intervene at specific molecular handshakes. You really have to be able to visualize that synapse, that tiny point of contact where two cells are talking. That's the battlefield.
Okay, so precision targeting. What's number 2?
Second is classes with character. Our arsenal is incredibly diverse now. It ranges from let's call it the broad hammer of corticosteroids, all the way to the sniper fire of monoclonal antibodies. And they are not interchangeable. Knowing which tool to use is everything.
I love that. A hammer versus a sniper rifle. It's not just one big off switch.
Number 3. Number 3 is the strategy of synergism. This is a massive concept in both texts. Why do clinicians use what they call multi-tier therapy? Why take 3 or 4 drugs when one powerful one might do?
It's all about the cocktail.
It is. It's about maximizing the immunological silence while minimizing the toxicity of any single drug. It's a very clever balancing act.
Okay, number 4.
Number 4 is the holy grail of the entire field. Tolerance versus suppression.
That's the dream, isn't it? Teaching the body to actually accept the graft as self, rather than just drugging it into submission for 50 years.
Exactly. It's the difference between, say, holding a beach ball underwater with all your strength versus the beach ball just deciding to stay there on its own. One requires constant effort, the other is a state of peace.
And finally, number 5.
The clinical balance. This is the day-to-day reality. It's managing the trade-off. Every single time you dial down the risk of rejection, you are dialing up the risk of infection or even malignancy. It is a constant, high-stakes tightrope walk.
Okay, that's a fantastic map. So let's dive into part 1, the target. To understand how to stop the immune system, we first have to understand how it attacks. Katsung does a brilliant job breaking this down into two main arms, the innate and the adaptive systems. Let's start with the first responders.
The innate system. This is the ancient primal part of our defense. It's described as immediate, nonspecific, and, crucially, pre-existing. It doesn't need to learn who the enemy is. It's hardwired to just know that something is wrong.
So this is like the castle walls, the moat, the guards on the parapet who just shoot at anything that doesn't have the right flag.
That's a perfect analogy. It starts with the physical barriers, your skin, the mucous membranes, the low pH in your stomach. But where it gets really interesting pharmacologically is with the chemical side. And Katsung puts a huge spotlight on the complement cascade. If you look at figure 55.1 in the text, it's just this incredible violent domino effect.
Walk us through that, because the word compliment sounds so polite, like you're paying someone a compliment. But what it actually does is, well, it's anything but.
It is incredibly violent. It's a series of about 20 proteins labeled C1 through C9, and they're just floating in your blood right now, totally inert. They're inactive precursors. But when they get triggered, say by a bacterium or an antibody-coated cell, they act like a row of falling dominoes. But here's the cool part. As they fall, they split, they cleave, and the fragments that are created have totally different jobs.
Okay, so the domino falls, breaks in two, and each piece runs off to do something else. I was reading about C3A and C5A.
Yeah.
In the text, they're described essentially as sirens, right?
Chemotaxis, that's the technical term, and it's exactly right. C3A and C5A are small fragments that float away from the site of the battle, let's say a cut on your finger, and they act as chemical beacons. They drift through the tissue, and they basically shout, hey, the fight is over here. All phagocytes, get over here now. They call in the cavalry.
The cavalry being the neutrophils and macrophages.
The big eaters. They follow that chemical trail right to the source of the infection.
And then there's the other piece, C3B. This one sounded almost culinary to me. The book calls it opsonization.
It is culinary in a cellular sense. The word comes from the Greek for to season or to prepare for eating. It's one of my favorite terms in immunology. C3b literally coats the surface of the invader.
Why? Why does it need seasoning?
Well, imagine a big macrophage, a big eater cell, trying to grab a slippery, fast-moving bacterium. It's hard, but if that bacterium is coated in C3b, the macrophage has special receptors that can grab onto the C3b. It acts like handles or Velcro. It makes the bacteria tasty and easy to grab and engulf.
So some pieces call for help, other pieces butter up the toast, so to speak. But the finale of this whole cascade isn't just about calling for help or seasoning the food. It's what the book calls the kill shot, the membrane attack complex.
The MAC. This is the grand finale. This is where proteins C5b through C9 all come together. They link up on the surface of the bacteria, and they literally form a drill. They assemble into a tube, a pore, that punches a hole right through the bacterial cell wall.
A hole in the membrane.
A huge hole. And then basic physics takes over. Water rushes in, essential salts rush out, the osmotic pressure collapses, and the bacterium just lyses, it explodes.
It is absolutely ruthless. Now, 99.9% of the time, we want this to happen. We want bacteria to explode.
Yeah.
But the text immediately introduces a drug called eculizumab. And this is where pharmacology steps in to deliberately stop this process. Why on earth would we want to stop the MAC?
This is such a great example of precise mechanism-based targeting. There's a rare and devastating condition called paroxysmal nocturnal hemoglobinuria, or PNH. In these patients, due to a genetic mutation, their own red blood cells are missing a protective shield that normally tells complement to leave them alone.
Oh, no.
So their own complement system makes a mistake. It sees their red blood cells as foreign, and it starts drilling holes in them. The MAC assembles on their own blood cells.
So your own body is systematically destroying your blood supply. That sounds terrifying.
It is. It leads to massive anemia, blood clots, terrible outcomes. So eculizumab, and there's a newer, longer-acting one called ravulizumab, acts as a very specific block. It's a monoclonal antibody that binds to the C5 protein.
It grabs one of the dominoes.
It grabs the C5 domino and holds it. It prevents it from splitting into C5a and C5b. And if you don't get C5b, you can't start building the drill.
The membrane attack complex it can't form.
Correct. The rest of the cascade, the opsonization, the chemotaxis, that still works to some degree. But you stop the final lethal step. You save the red blood cells. It's a perfect example of knowing exactly which domino to glue in place so the rest don't fall. And it shows how we can intervene in this living system to correct a very specific defect.
That's the innate system. Fast, brutal, non-specific. But for transplants and autoimmunity, the real strategic problem usually lies with the other arm of defense, the adaptive system, the precision strikers, as the outline calls them.
Right. The adaptive system is different. It's specific. It learns. It has memory. And the five-star general of this entire army is the T cell. If you want to stop organ rejection, you have to find a way to control the T cell.
And this brings us to what might be the single most important visual in this entire deep dive, the synapse.
The immunological synapse. Katsung has a diagram of this, and if you're a student of this stuff, you should have it tattooed on your brain. It's the point of contact, the handshake, between an antigen-presenting cell, an APC, and a T cell. This single moment is the decision point. It's where the war begins or where peace is maintained.
Let's unpack that handshake. Because it's not just one touch, is it? It's a very careful, multi-signal process.
It's a multi-signal process.
Yeah.
Think of it like a nuclear launch sequence. You need two keys turned simultaneously. You don't want the system going off by accident.
Okay, so what's the first key turn?
Signal 1 is all about identification. The APC, which would be a macrophage or a dendritic cell, has eaten something foreign, maybe a piece of a virus or, in our case, a protein from a transplanted kidney. It processes it and holds out a tiny piece of it, the antigen, on a special platter called the MHC, the major histocompatibility complex.
And the T cell comes along and checks it.
The T cell receptor, the TCR, physically checks that antigen. It's asking the question, have I seen you before? Are you foreign? That's signal 1. It's checking the ID card.
So are you a threat? But that's not enough to launch the attack.
That's the crucial part. It is not enough. In fact, if a T cell only gets signal 1, it actually goes to sleep. It enters a state called anergy. It becomes unresponsive. This is a critical safety feature to prevent autoimmunity against things that might be floating around harmlessly.
So it needs a second signal, a confirmation.
It needs verification, that's signal 2, or co-stimulation. The APC has another molecule on its surface, usually called CD80 or CD86, and the T cell has a receptor for it called CD28. When CD80 binds to CD28 at the same time the TCR is binding to the MHC, that is the second key turn.
And the engine roars to life.
The engine roars to life. The T cell is now fully activated. It starts making cytokines. It prepares to divide. It goes to war. Both signals are absolutely required.
And this is where it gets so elegant pharmacologically. Because nature, of course, has its own brake pedal for this process, doesn't it?
It does. It has a molecule called CTLA4. Think of this as the natural off switch. Once a T cell gets activated and starts doing its job, after a while it starts to express CTLA4 on its surface.
And what does CTLA4 do?
It also binds to CD80-86 on the APC,
Yeah.
but it binds with a much, much higher affinity than CD28 does, so it muscles CD28 out of the way. And when CTLA4 binds, instead of sending a go signal, it sends a powerful stop signal to the T cell. It's a beautiful negative feedback loop to ensure the immune response doesn't rage on forever.
And I have a feeling we're going to see pharmacology hijack that mechanism later on.
You can bet on it.
Okay, so the T cell activates. It's got both signals. Then it has to decide what kind of soldier it's going to be. The texts talk about Th1 versus Th2 differentiation.
Right.
Why is that distinction so important?
It's critical because the type of helper T cell, which is what the tail stands for, determines the entire strategy of the war that's about to be fought. And that decision is based on the cytokine environment, basically the chemical soup the T cell is swimming in at the moment of activation.
So the local chemicals tell it what kind of threat it's facing.
Exactly. If there's a cytokine called IL-12 around, which is typically produced in response to viruses and intracellular bacteria, the helper T cell becomes a Th1 cell.
What's the Th1 playbook?
Th1 drives what we call cell-mediated immunity. It's all about activating the killers. It wakes up macrophages to make them more lethal, and it helps activate cytotoxic T lymphocytes, or CTLs, whose job is to go out and directly kill infected cells, or in our case, the cells of a transplanted organ. Th1 is the primary driver of graft rejection.
Okay, so Th1 is the one we really worry about in transplants. What about Th2?
If, on the other hand, the local environment is rich in a cytokine called IL-4, the T cell differentiates into a Th2 cell. Th2 has a totally different mission. It drives humoral immunity, the B cells. It tells B cells to proliferate and, crucially, to switch their antibody production to IgE.
And IgE is the antibody famous for allergies.
Exactly. Th2 immunity is geared towards fighting parasites and is also the central player in allergies and asthma. So if you're treating a transplant patient, you are desperate to stop the Th1 response. If you're treating a patient with severe asthma, you might be more focused on blocking Th2 pathways. The strategy depends entirely on the enemy.
This is a fantastic map of the battlefield. We've got the innate system with its sirens and drills, and the adaptive system with its two-key handshakes and its specialized generals. So now, Let's open the arsenal. Part 2.
Let's talk about the weapons.
We're going to look at the mechanisms of restraint. And we have to start with the oldest, the broadest, the one everyone loves to hate, the glucocorticoids. We're talking about prednisone.
The classic. There's a joke in medicine. What are the two best drugs? Prednisone and more prednisone. It's used for everything from poison ivy to multiple sclerosis to heart transplants. But in the context of immunosuppression, it truly is a blunt instrument.
And how does it work? Because it's not working on the cell surface, grabbing receptors like the things we just discussed, is it?
No, and that's a really key point. That's why it takes some time to work, hours to days. Glucocorticoids are steroids, so they are lipophilic, they dissolve in fat. This means they can slip right through the cell membrane without needing a receptor or a channel.
You just walk right in the front door.
They walk in the front door, find their specific glucocorticoid receptor floating in the cytoplasm, bind to it, and then the whole drug receptor complex marches right into the nucleus of the cell.
It goes right to headquarters.
Right to the DNA. It's a transcription factor. It directly affects which genes get turned on and which get turned off. It is literally rewriting the cell's instruction manual for the day.
And what's the key instruction it's rewriting?
The key action, the one that matters most for immunosuppression, is that it massively decreases the activation of a protein called NFP. Now, you can think of NFP as the master switch for inflammation. It's the transcription factor that turns on the production of almost all the pro-inflammatory cytokines. IL-1, IL-2, IL-6, TNF-alpha, the whole rogues gallery.
So by blocking NFP, prednisone just turns down the master volume on the entire immune response.
That's a perfect way to put it. It turns down the volume on T cells, B cells, macrophages, everything. It stops the production of the cytokines that fuel the fire, and it even causes lymphocytes to undergo apoptosis, or programmed cell death.
That sounds incredibly effective for stopping rejection. But it also sounds incredibly dangerous for everything else.
It is. That's the trade-off. Because it affects the transcription of so many genes and so many different cell types, the side effects are enormous. You get metabolic changes, high blood sugar, diabetes, you get bone loss, osteoporosis, thin skin, easy bruising, mood changes, psychosis, increased risk of infection. It's effective, but it's dirty. That's why we call it the broad hammer. We use it when we have to, but the goal is always to use the lowest possible dose for the shortest possible time.
Okay, so that's the hammer. But medicine needed something more precise. And that brings us to class 2, the calcineurin inhibitors. The texts describe these as the absolute foundation of modern transplant therapy. We're talking about tacrolimus and cyclosporine.
These drugs and cyclosporine came first, completely changed the world. Before them, organ transplantation was largely experimental with terrible long-term outcomes. These agents made it a routine, life-saving procedure.
And they work in a totally different way than prednisone. They're more targeted.
Much more targeted. Tacrolimus works inside the T cell. So let's go back to our handshake. Signal 1 and signal 2 have just happened. One of the immediate downstream consequences inside that T cell is a massive influx of calcium. Calcium levels inside the cell spike.
And that calcium spike is a signal.
It's the next domino. That calcium activates a protein called calcineurin, and calcineurin is a phosphatase, which means its job is to clip phosphate groups off of other proteins.
Okay, so what's its target?
Its target is a crucial transcription factor called NFAT nuclear factor of activated T cells. Normally, NFAT has a phosphate group on it, and you can think of that phosphate like a lock that keeps it trapped in the cytoplasm. It can't get into the nucleus.
But calcineurin has the key.
Calcineurin is the bolt cutter. It clicks off that phosphate group, unlocking NFAT. Now, NFAT is free to travel into the nucleus, find the DNA, and turn on the gene for IL-2.
And we mentioned cytokines earlier, IL-2. That's the big one for T cells, isn't it?
Yeah. It's the fuel. IL-2 is the primary growth factor for T cells. It's the multiply command. It's an autocrine signal. The T cell makes it and then uses it to stimulate itself to divide. An activated T cell that can't make IL-2 is a soldier who's been told to build an army but has no food and no water for his troops. The army never gets built.
So tacrolimus stops this. How?
Tacrolimus enters the cell and binds to a little protein inside called FKBP. This drug protein complex then physically sits on calcineurin and blocks its activity. It gums up the works.
It stops the bolt cutter.
It stops the bolt cutter. So calcineurin can't dephosphorylate NFAT. NFAT stays locked in the cytoplasm. It never gets into the nucleus. And the T cell never makes IL-2.
So the T cell sees the enemy, it gets the signal to fight, but it literally runs out of gas before it can multiply into an army.
That is exactly it. It starves the immune response of the fuel it needs to proliferate, and that's why it's so profoundly effective for preventing transplant rejection. You stop the army from ever growing in the first place.
But of course, there's always a but. Even tacrolimus, this miracle drug, has major issues, doesn't it? The text is very clear about nephrotoxicity.
A huge issue, and a tragically ironic one. Tacrolimus is toxic to the kidneys over time. It causes vasoconstriction, a tightening of the small blood vessels in the kidney, which reduces blood flow and can lead to chronic kidney disease.
And many of the people taking it are kidney transplant patients.
Exactly. You are giving a drug to save the kidney that is simultaneously slowly poisoning the kidney. It's a major clinical challenge, and it forces us to be incredibly careful with dosing, with monitoring blood levels, which we'll get to later.
It's the perfect example of that clinical balance you mentioned, which leads us into the modern era of immunosuppression. Class 3, the biologics, these are the surgical tools, the monoclonal antibodies.
These are the snipers.
We talked about the handshake earlier, that critical two-signal process. Can we use these tools to block that handshake directly?
We can. This is the mechanism of a drug called abatacept. It's one of the most elegant drug designs, I think. Remember how we talked about CTLA-4, the natural brake pedal that the T cell uses to shut itself down?
The one that muscles CD28 out of the way?
Right. Well, scientists took the binding part of CTLA-4, the part that grabs onto CD8086, and they engineered a fusion protein. They stitched it onto the tail end of an IgG antibody to make it stable and long-lasting in the blood.
So abatacept is basically a free-floating synthetic brake pedal.
That's a perfect description. It circulates in the blood, it finds an antigen-presenting cell, and it binds tightly to all the CD8086 molecules on its surface. It essentially covers up the docking port for signal 2.
So when the T cell comes along, ready for its go signal.
When the T cell comes in with its CD28 receptor looking for that second key turn, it can't find any way to bind. The port is already occupied by abatacept.
It physically breaks the handshake, or prevents it from happening.
It blocks signal 2. And without signal 2, as we discussed, the T cell doesn't activate. In fact, it's pushed towards that state of anergy, of unresponsiveness. It's a very clever, very upstream way to stop the entire response before it even starts.
What about blocking the fuel? We just talked about how critical IL-2 is. Can we block that?
We can. And that's the job of basiliximab and an older one, daclizumab. These are monoclonal antibodies, but their target is different. They bind to a molecule called CD25.
And what's CD25?
CD25 is the high-affinity alpha chain of the IL-2 receptor. So when a T cell becomes activated, one of the first things it does is put up more IL-2 receptors on its surface so it can listen for the growth signal. CD25 is a key part of that receptor. It's like the T cell putting up a bigger antenna.
So basiliximab?
The basiliximab is an antibody that sticks to that antenna. It blocks the receptor. It's essentially putting earmuffs on the activated T cell.
I love that visual. Earmuffs for the T cell.
Even if there is IL-2 floating around, made by other cells, the T cell can't hear the proliferate command. It's used very commonly during the initial induction phase of a transplant for this reason.
Yeah, there's one more biologic I want to touch on because it's in a slightly different world but affects so many people. Omalizumab. This is for allergies, not transplants.
Right, a great example of applying these principles to a different pathology. In severe allergic asthma, the problem isn't T cells trying to kill an organ. The problem is an antibody called IgE.
This is the Th2 pathway we mentioned.
Exactly. In allergic individuals, their B cells are told to make huge amounts of IgE against things like pollen or dust mites. That IgE then circulates and attaches itself to the surface of mast cells, which are like little grenades packed with histamine just waiting in your tissues.
So the IgE acts as the trigger.
It's the trigger.
Yeah.
When you then breathe in pollen, it binds to the IgE on the mast cell, and the mast cell explodes. It degranulates, releasing a massive flood of histamine.
And that's what causes the swelling, the bronchoconstriction, the itching, the asthma attack.
That's the whole allergic reaction. So omalizumab is incredibly clever. It's a monoclonal antibody against another antibody. It's an anti-IgE antibody.
It attacks our own antibodies.
It does. It binds to the part of the IgE molecule that would normally attach to the mast cell. It basically catches the IgE out of the blood before it can ever land on the mast cell and arm the grenade.
So you prevent the match from ever striking the box.
Perfectly put. If the IgE can't attach to the mast cell, then when the pollen comes along, there's no trigger. It stops the sensitization phase from ever becoming the effector phase. It's a beautiful way to prevent the cascade before symptoms even have a chance to start.
Okay, so this is an incredible arsenal. We have the hammer, the foundation, and now the snipers. But having the best weapons in the world isn't enough. You need a battle plan.
You need a strategy.
And this brings us to part 3 of our deep dive, strategic application. This is where we pull heavily from the general approach laid out in Goodman and Gilman. They list 5 principles for transplant therapy, but I want to focus on the big ones. Let's start with multi-tier therapy.
This is the absolute standard of care. You will almost never see a solid organ transplant patient on just one drug. That would be considered malpractice, frankly. The concept is synergy.
So using multiple drugs at once, why is that better?
Let's think about the math of toxicity. If you use a high enough dose of just tacrolimus to prevent rejection, you will absolutely destroy the patient's kidneys. If you use a high enough dose of just prednisone, you'll cause severe diabetes and osteoporosis. If you use a high enough dose of an antimetabolite like mycophenolate, you'll wipe out their bone marrow.
Each one has a dose-limiting toxicity.
Precisely. So instead of using one drug at a toxic dose, you use 3 drugs at lower, less toxic doses. You attack the immune system from 3 different angles at the same time.
Give me an example of a common cocktail.
A very common maintenance regimen would be low-dose tacrolimus, low-dose mycophenolate, and very low-dose, or even, prednisone.
And what is each one doing?
You're hitting the lymphocyte's life cycle at 3 distinct points. The tacrolimus blocks calcineurin, so you're not making IL-2. That's no proliferation signal. The mycophenolate blocks the synthesis of purines, the building blocks of DNA, so even if a cell gets a signal to divide, it can't replicate its genes. And the prednisone provides that broad anti-inflammatory blanket, turning down all the other cytokine chatter.
So by hitting all 3 targets simultaneously, you achieve profound immunosuppression, but you keep the dose of each individual drug low enough to hopefully stay below its major toxicity threshold.
That's it. You widen the therapeutic window. It's about being smarter, not just stronger with one agent.
Great. The next big principle is induction versus maintenance. This sounds like military strategy.
It absolutely is. Think of it like a campaign. Induction is the shock and awe phase. It's the invasion.
What's happening in that phase?
Right when you put that new organ in, the recipient's immune system is screaming. It sees this massive foreign object, and every alarm bell is going off. The risk of acute rejection is at its absolute highest in the first few days and weeks.
So you have to hit it hard.
You have to hit it incredibly hard and fast. This is where we use our most powerful and often most dangerous drugs. We might use something called antithymocyte globulin, or ATG.
What on earth is that?
It is basically what it sounds like. You take human T cells, inject them into a rabbit or a horse, and the animal makes a whole slew of antibodies against all the different proteins on a human T cell. We then purify those antibodies and infuse them into the patient.
And it just wipes out their T cell.
It's a profound T cell depleting agent. It literally strips the T cells out of the patient's circulation. You are essentially knocking the adaptive immune system unconscious for a short period so the new organ can settle in and graft without being immediately attacked.
That sounds intense.
It is, but you can't keep a patient like that forever. They would have no defense against viruses like CMV or EBV or even basic bacteria. They die of an infection.
So once the initial crisis period is over, you transition.
You transition to maintenance. This is the long-term occupation phase. You withdraw the heavy-duty depleting agents, and you settle them on that multi-drug cocktail we just talked about. Tacrolimus, mycophenolate, maybe a tiny bit of prednisone. The doses are much lower. The goal shifts.
How does the goal shift?
It's a crucial point. In the induction phase, your primary fear is rejection. In the long-term maintenance phase, your primary fear shifts to drug toxicity, infection, and malignancy. You are less worried about the organ failing today and more worried about the patient developing kidney failure from the tacrolimus in 10 years, or a skin cancer because their immune surveillance is turned down.
So the price of the transplant is trading one acute disease, like kidney failure, for a new set of chronic, managed risks.
That is the deal we make. It becomes a chronic condition that has to be managed for life.
And how do we know if we have that balance right,
Yeah.
day to day? This brings us to the principle of monitoring. The texts get very specific about this, talking about C2 levels. Why are we timing these blood draws so carefully?
Pharmacokinetics. Drugs like tacrolimus and cyclosporine are incredibly tricky. They have what we call a narrow therapeutic index. This means the difference between a dose that is effective and a dose that is toxic is tiny, a very small window.
And it's not the same for everyone?
Not at all. If you and I take the exact same 5 milligram dose of tacrolimus, your blood level might be twice as high as mine. It depends on how fast our livers metabolize it, which is controlled by our CYP3A4 enzymes. It even depends on what we ate. If you drink grapefruit juice, it blocks that enzyme, and your tacrolimus level will shoot up into the toxic range.
So you have to measure. Goodman and Gilman makes a point that we've moved from just measuring trough levels to measuring C2 levels. What's the difference?
Right. For years, we measured the trough level, which is the blood level right before you take your next dose. It's the lowest point. But research showed that the C2 level, the blood level measured exactly 2 hours after the dose, actually gives a much better estimate of the area under the curves, or AUC.
And the AUC is the important number.
The AUC represents the total exposure the body has to the drug over a dosing interval. The peak concentration, which happens around C2, is a better surrogate for that total exposure than the trough. If the C2 is too high, you're getting too much exposure and risking toxicity. If it's too low, you're not getting enough exposure and you're risking rejection. It's a constant, careful adjustment based on those lab values.
It is absolutely not set it and forget it.
Never. A transplant patient is managed and monitored for the rest of their life. It requires constant clinical vigilance.
Now, despite all of this strategy, the synergy, the shock and awe, the constant monitoring these potent drugs, sometimes it fails. And that brings us to part 4, clinical reality. Katsung includes a really gripping and frankly scary case study on graft versus host disease. I want to walk through this because it just perfectly illustrates the stakes when restraint is not enough.
This case is a perfect and tragic example of what we call immunological escape, when the system breaks through our defenses.
So, the scenario is a 59-year-old woman. She has myelodysplastic syndrome, which means her bone marrow is failing. She needs a new one. She gets a hematopoietic stem cell transplant from a donor. Now, the doctors know that graft versus host disease, or GVHD, is the major risk here. And GVHD is basically the mirror image of rejection, isn't it?
It is. It's the reverse. In a kidney transplant, your body, the host, attacks the new kidney, the graft. In a stem cell transplant, you've been given a whole new immune system. That new immune system, the graft, wakes up inside you, looks around, and attacks you, the host.
The donor T cells see the patient's body as foreign.
The donor T cells look at the patient's skin, their liver, their gut, and they say, this is all foreign. Attack. It's one of the most feared complications.
So she's on prophylaxis. The doctors are trying to prevent this. She's taking tacrolimus and methotrexate. That's the standard restraint we've just been talking about. But about a month after the transplant, she develops a rash.
And that's the first warning sign. The skin is often the first battlefield in GVHD. A biopsy is done, and it confirms grade 2 to them, acute GVHD. This means, despite the drugs, the donor T cells are activated and are attacking. The tacrolimus isn't holding them back enough. The escape has begun.
So the doctors have to escalate. They add prednisone. They bring out the hammer. 1 milligram per kilogram per day. That is a solid, potent dose.
That's the standard first-line treatment for acute GVHD. You hit it with high-dose steroids.
But a week later, it's not better. The rash is worse. Her liver enzymes are shooting up. And now she has bloody diarrhea.
This is the nightmare scenario. This is terrifying. The bloody diarrhea means the donor T cells are now attacking the lining of her intestines, sloughing it off. The rising liver enzymes mean they're destroying the bile ducts in her liver. This has now progressed to grade 4 GVHD. This is life-threatening.
They try even higher doses. Intravenous methylprednisolone, just massive pulses of steroids. Now the case says it fails. No improvement. What is happening here? Why aren't our best drugs working anymore?
This is a state we call steroid refractory GVHD, and it's one of the most difficult problems in medicine. For whatever reason, the immune response has become so robust, so amplified by cytokine storms and positive feedback loops, that the standard mechanisms we rely on, blocking IL-2 with tacrolimus, blocking NFEC with steroids, they're just overwhelmed.
The fire's too big for the extinguisher.
The fire is too big. The T cells may have found ways to bypass the checkpoints we're blocking, or they're being driven by other cytokines we aren't targeting, like IL-6 or TNF-alpha. The system has escaped our control.
The case ends with the question, what is the next step?
And that's where clinicians have to get creative and aggressive, and the prognosis gets very poor. You have to bring in second and third line therapies. Maybe you use antithymocyte globulin, ATG, to just try and physically remove the T cells from the blood. Maybe you try a newer biologic that blocks a different pathway, like a JK inhibitor, like ruxolitinib. But the big takeaway from this case is humility. Despite our smart missiles and our hammers, the immune system can still outsmart us. It's a powerful reminder that we are managing a complex, adaptive system, not just fixing a simple machine.
It's a really sobering reminder of the power we are trying to contain. Now, I want to pivot because we've spent the last 45 minutes talking about holding the immune system back, putting it in handcuffs, choosing restraint. But part 5 of our outline takes us to the absolute flip side of this coin. There is one area of medicine where we don't want restraint, where we, in fact, demand total unrestrained activation, and that's immuno-oncology.
This is, without a doubt, the most exciting frontier in medicine right now. It's a complete paradigm shift. For decades, we treated cancer with chemo, just poisoning any cell that divides rapidly, or radiation. But there was always this nagging question, why doesn't the immune system just kill the cancer? A cancer cell is mutated. It's full of weird proteins. It should look foreign.
And it turns out the reason is that cancer is clever. It has learned to exploit the very same safety mechanisms we've just been discussing to hide from the immune system.
It's diabolically clever. Cancer co-opts the checkpoints to protect itself. So let's go back to our synapse. Remember we talked about signal 1 and signal 2, and the brake pedal, CTLA4? Well, there's another, even more important brake pedal called PD-1.
Program Death 1.
Right. It's another off switch on the surface of the T cell. Normal, healthy tissues in your body express ligand for it, called PD-L1, and this is a way for them to tell a passing T cell, hey, I'm innocent. I'm self, don't kill me. It's a secret handshake for, I'm one of the good guys.
And cancer cells have learned this handshake.
They've learned to express PD-L1 on their own surface. So a T cell, an anti-cancer T cell, marches up to a tumor. It recognizes a mutated cancer antigen, that's signal 1. It knows it's bad. But then the tumor cell reaches out with its PD-L1, shakes the PD-1 hand on the T cell, and the T cell just, it turns off. It falls asleep right at the goal line. The tumor has successfully tricked the immune system into choosing restraint.
So the new class of drugs that has revolutionized cancer treatment, the checkpoint inhibitors, is designed to break this specific fraudulent handshake.
Yeah.
Drugs like pembrolizumab or nivolumab.
Yes. These are monoclonal antibodies, but instead of suppressing, they activate. They bind to the PD-1 receptor on the T cell, they physically block it, they put a piece of tape over the off switch.
So now when the tumor tries to reach out with its phony PD-L1 peace offering,
it can't make contact, the port is blocked, the T cell never gets the off signal, it stays angry, it recognizes the cancer as foreign, and it attacks. We are taking the brakes off the immune system.
we are essentially cutting the brake lines on the T cell tank.
That is the perfect metaphor. In transplantation, we are trying to cut the fuel line to the engine by blocking IL-2. In cancer, we are trying to cut the brake lines by blocking PD-1. It's the same system, just opposite goals.
But as always, there is a cost. If you cut the brakes on the tank, it doesn't just run over the tumor.
It runs over everything. And the side effects of these drugs are the mirror image of the side effects of immunosuppressants. They're called immune-related adverse events, and they are essentially drug-induced autoimmunity.
The immune system, now unleashed, starts attacking normal tissue.
Exactly. You get colitis because the T cells attack the gut. You get pneumonitis, they attack the lungs. You get thyroiditis, hepatitis, severe rashes. By taking the brakes off, you risk the immune system losing its ability to distinguish self from non-self. So in transplant medicine, our constant fear is infection. In checkpoint inhibition, our constant fear is autoimmunity.
It so perfectly highlights that idea of the clinical balance we started with. We are constantly on this knife's edge, toggling this incredibly powerful system between protect self and destroy other. Which leads us to the final frontier, part 6, the future. Goodman and Gilman spends a lot of time on this. They talk about the Holy Grail. Currently, what we do is suppression, but the ultimate goal is tolerance. What is the fundamental difference?
Suppression is what we do now. It's active, it's forceful. You have to take a pill every single day to hold the immune system down. If you stop taking that pill, the rejection comes roaring back. It's that image of holding a beach ball underwater. It requires constant energy and pressure.
And tolerance.
Tolerance is when the immune system decides on its own not to attack. It's a state of voluntary antigen-specific peace. You don't need drugs anymore. The beach ball just stays underwater on its own accord. This is the natural state we have towards our own organs. The goal is to teach the body to view that transplanted kidney as self.
How on earth do we get there? The text mentions costimulatory blockade as one of the most promising paths.
Right. Let's go back to the handshake one last time. We said that if a T cell gets signal 1, the ID check, without signal 2, the costimulation, it doesn't just fail to activate, it becomes anergic. It becomes permanently unresponsive to that specific antigen.
Well, the idea is to manipulate that.
The idea is, what if we could time the drugs perfectly? Right at the moment of transplant, when all those donor antigens are flooding the system, what if we could block signal 2 with something like a abatacept while allowing signal 1 to happen? Could we trick all the T cells that are specific for that new kidney into becoming permanently energic?
That would mean a patient gets a transplant, takes drugs for maybe a few weeks or months to induce that state, and then they could stop.
That's the dream. That's the billion-dollar prize. No lifelong nephrotoxicity from tacrolimus. No lifelong risk of infection and cancer. Just true biological acceptance.
There's also a concept they mentioned that sounds like straight science fiction, donor cell chimerism.
This is a really fascinating area of research. It involves, in essence, mixing the immune systems. The idea is that you give a patient not just a kidney from a donor, but also some of the donor's bone marrow stem cells.
So you're transplanting part of their immune system as well.
Exactly. If you can get those donor stem cells to take up residence in the patient's bone marrow and create a small, stable population of donor immune cells, you create a state of chimerism. The patient has a dual immune system. Some of their immune cells are their own, some are the donor's.
And how does that create tolerance?
Well, the new donor immune cells are now living happily in the patient. And as the patient's own T cells are developing, they see these donor cells and are educated to recognize them as self. So when they see a kidney with the same markers, they leave it alone. You're blurring the line between self and other at the most fundamental level.
You aren't fighting the distinction, you're erasing it.
That's the concept. It's incredibly difficult to achieve safely, but it's another path toward that ultimate goal.
It's just incredible to step back and think about how far this field has come. From, observing that some soil fungus in Norway, where cyclosporine came from, stopped cells from growing, to now being able to map the precise molecular handshake of a T-cell synapse and design drugs to either block it or enhance it.
And yet, we are still humbled by cases like that patient with GVHD. We have these incredibly powerful tools, but the biological network we're trying to control is still orders of magnitude more complex than our interventions.
So let's try and synthesize this. Let's wrap it up. We've covered the paradox of defense. We've mapped the landscape, the innate sirens and the adaptive handshakes. We've opened the arsenal, the prednisone hammers, the tacrolimus foundations, and the biologic snipers. We've looked at the strategy of multi-drug cocktails. We've seen the tragic reality of failure in GVHD and the stunning flip side success in cancer. What's the final provocative thought we should leave the listener with?
I think if we connect all these dots, for the last half-century, pharmacology has mostly been about interruption, blocking a receptor, inhibiting an enzyme, cutting a fuel line. It's a very mechanical view. I think we are now moving into an era of instruction.
Instruction. What do you mean by that?
Instead of just shouting stop at the immune system, we are trying to find ways to say, learn. Whether it's teaching the system to ignore a kidney, which is the goal of tolerance, or teaching it to finally see a hidden cancer, which is the goal of checkpoint inhibition, the future is about communicating with the immune system in its own language, not just bludgeoning it into submission.
That is a powerful shift, moving from suppression to a conversation. And for you listening, if you really want to graph this, I urge you to go back to Katsung, find those diagrams of the immune synapse. The secret to the next generation of these drugs, to this new era of instruction, it lies in those tiny molecular handshakes. Reading the source material is absolutely essential to visualize the complexity we've just been talking about.
Absolutely. The deeper you look at that synapse, the more you realize that these incredibly small, specific interactions are what drive these profound life and death outcomes for our patients.
Thank you for diving deep with us today. This has been fascinating. We'll catch you on the next one.
Stay curious.